Today on Rebuilders, we have asked you, our subscribers, what your questions are for us. So what kind of things do we cover, Mark?
We cover lots of things. We talk about the future of universities, college ministries. We talk about the role South Africa has to play in God's plan in the world. We talk about why are people sort of reshuffling through churches post-COVID. That, lots more. I'm excited.
Great. Let's kick it off. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name's Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel back in the studio. How are you both?
I'm good.
Fantastic. Good to be here. Good to have you back, Liddy. Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Thank you. That was like a significant amount of enthusiasm there, Daniel, and I appreciate it.
Just coming out the gate strong.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I just say, I was on the way into the office today, drove past the bakery where I used to stop to pick up pastries.
Yeah.
Oh.
Part of me just had to let that go.
But I noticed when I travelled, a lot of people mentioned pastries, like Rebuilders listings, complimentary pastries.
Yeah, well, look, we went pretty hard for a while there.
Yeah. The memory for me was like, there's no other cars around. There's no one parked next to the bakery because there's just nobody. Everyone else is in lockdown.
Yeah,
and here
that's
I am.
Yeah. Well, I have eaten today, though. Not a pastry, but I have eaten a carrot cake, which Liddy made and brought into the office for us to all eat. So it was fantastic. And in fact, I would say better than a pastry and indicative of our inflationary age where pastries now cost $17.
Well, carrots. How much do carrots
They're
cost?
pretty cheap.
No, I got a bag of them the other day for like $1.90 or something.
I brought 2 zucchinis for $7.
What?
I know. I didn't look at it before
So
I bought
zucchinis for our UK and New
Courgettes.
Zealand. Courgettes.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, and for Daniel as well. I didn't know.
Yeah.
I know. What's the there's another vegetable, isn't there?
Eggplant and aubergine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't there like
cilantro and coriander.
There's lots of them.
Bell peppers and capsicum.
Yep.
amazing. Well,
Butternut pumpkins here are like referred to as squashes.
Yes.
Yep.
squashes are something different, aren't they?
Well, here they are, yeah.
They're like those little
yellow.
Those
zucchini type
things are
things.
evil.
Oh, I don't know why
Squashes
you
are
eat them.
evil.
No, they're not. They're delicious.
They are.
There's nothing.
No.
good
Fry
about
them up with some butter and some salt. Oh,
That's the butter and the salt doing the job.
Yeah,
there.
exactly. I think the snake in the garden ate squashes.
all right. I'm on Team Squash, so you guys can just all settle
The
down.
great rift of 2022.
Yeah.
I'm just not on the
Great
podcast
rift-
anymore.
The great rift of Genesis. Squashes and snakes. Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm just going to move us on. Thank you to everyone who responded. Oh,
So
those
did
of
you
you
say,
who are our
sorry,
subscribers.
I'm interrupting.
Oh, you're going back
Second
to
week I've
squashes.
spoken over you. Did you say the great rift of 2020?
2022.
Okay, sorry, continue. That was worth stopping you.
Yeah.
Good clarity.
Oh, you needed to check the year. Gotcha.
Yeah, sorry. Please forgive me.
Oh, forgiveness is flowing.
Oh, thank you.
No worries. So for those of you who are our subscribers, we sent out an email less than 24 hours ago, actually, to ask you to send us your questions. So listener questions, we've done them a few times over the years, and we put it to you, and we had a whole raft of responses come in. So thank you to everyone who has already responded. We'll be keeping an eye on the inbox as well if further ones come in. But we're going to address a few of these questions today.
Yeah. I thought it was too late. I thought when this was discussed, I'm like, no one's going to send anything through. It's the afternoon. What are you doing?
Full confidence in
The
our
stacks came
subscribers.
through.
Yeah.
Went to bed, woke up.
Yep.
It's like Jack and the Beanstalk.
Oh, this is the beauty of like
internet.
global listenership as well.
Yeah, it's true.
And the internet.
Yeah.
We were sleeping and they were busy sending replies. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Just on that, if you aren't already a subscriber, you can subscribe by heading to rebuilders.co and hitting the subscriber section up in the top of the website, and you will get these emails as well. So shall we just kick into it?
Let us kick off.
Great. So we're going to get through as many as we can for this episode, and we'll save the ones that we don't get through for a future episode. Let's go. So this first one is from Alan, and it says, I work in campus ministry in the States and I'm curious, How do you perceive the global trends you're seeing affecting higher education? And how do you think those of us ministering in this context of 18 to 22-year-olds could adjust in light of that?
Fantastic question. Thank you, Alan.
Do you want me to take this one? Or?
Go for it.
Oh, sorry. That was a joke. I'll do that for every question.
Do that for every question. A few things. So I think we're seeing a tremendous transformation and disruption of, well, first of all, we're seeing a disruption, and I think we then will see a transformation of all institutions in our society. And obviously universities are a pretty central institution. If you go back to, even look at the history of institutions like Oxford and Cambridge and Princeton and these, going back centuries and even further, for some of these places. And really what they were was formational spaces for people who were going to come into, particularly into early on, the vision was, the clergy, look at Oxford and Cambridge and these places and Princeton and these, so on. But also then into, I guess, the leadership of society. One of the things that we've seen in more recent times is really the way that universities have made money through selling degrees, in the sense of an ever-increasing expansion of courses on offer. And whereas in the past, you go back a few decades, it wasn't expected everyone went to university. Increasingly, that's seen as something which the majority of people should try and do. You've seen in places like Australia, where universities, and particularly overseas students, has become an incredible driver of income for universities, and I think is bigger than agriculture in Australia, with overseas students coming in as a driver of our GDP. But some of the trends that we've spoken about is the decentralization that's occurring in our society and the draining of authority away from institutions. And I think we've seen that in a couple of ways. With universities. The first one is increasingly, and actually I think my brother may have done his some sort of postgraduate studies on this, because he's in the field of education. And I think he was here for lunch. We could have just pulled him in for this.
Oh, we should have.
But, his sort of studies is looking at how sort of online learning, and particularly the fact that increasingly there's things being offered online for free, is going to affect the university. And, people sort of say, that hasn't happened yet. But I think it could happen. And, you've got some of these online offerings where you've got, hundreds and hundreds of students from all over the world on, and some of them are really high quality. So I sort of feel like in some ways where universities are at, it's maybe like what record companies were maybe in the 90s.
Yeah, okay.
Just before, Napster came along and sort of disrupted the entire industry. So I think you're still going to have your legacy sort of institutions like an Oxford or some of the, Ivy League colleges, and there's Sorbonne and, these sort of different places. But I think you're actually going to see a huge disruption. What institution is the communication of information. And you're seeing, I think, the formational element of those universities change, because less and less people are on campus. There was a famous tweet someone put up here in Australia. It's actually before the pandemic, but it was a university lecturer. I think it might have been at Melbourne University or RMIT here in Melbourne. And he just put up a picture saying, the contemporary lecturer's dilemma. And he took a photo of the class and no one had turned up.
Yeah.
And so that sort of formational in-person community forming of people for, to lead in a culture, that's sort of disappearing as it's becoming more just information transference. And, I think that can be done online. So that's going to be hugely disruptive. So I think we could see many universities not be around. I'm going to put it out there in a few decades. So that's going to be interesting. Number 2 point is the loss of authorities from universities. And I think one of the big, things that have been spoken about, I remember years ago going to visit a friend, this is well before everyone was talking about culture wars and all this sort of stuff, going to visit a friend at lunch at his university, and sort of driving into the university from sort of the quiet streets around it into the quadrangle at the center of this university. It was like some huge sort of cultural protest and different groups all yelling at each other. I thought, this is really bizarre. And then seeing how in some ways that space at that time, which seemed strange, is now replicated all over the culture. And I think some of the sort of dynamics that the university is trying to sort of deal with, which is how do liberal societies, liberal democracies actually deal with a diversity of opinion, and which is really the question of how does liberalism, which promotes a diversity of opinion and was attempted to be a solution to a diversity of opinion, how does that then deal with opinions that it doesn't necessarily agree with?
Yeah.
So you're seeing this whole sort of, a lot of the council culture and all this sort of stuff, that those battles sort of began in the university. So, I think that's another thing where people are seeing legitimacy drain away from the university, and the university itself has become there was cultural war clashes happening at universities. Now the idea of the university is sort of, culturally, a battleground itself. So I think all of these are at play. But for those, I think the question Alan's asking here too is for those of people, and there are many who are involved in ministry in campuses, I think that question of formation is really key, because I think the university, as it's realised its formational capacity is disappearing, in some ways it's pushed further in that ability to form people in a particular thought, because they see that those people are then going into the high echelons which control the wider society. So I think the discernment of culture is something we took a lot on here, and we talk about missiology, which is like, how do we read culture through the lens of the gospel? I think you cannot do college or university ministry without that at this point in time. And I think that in many ways, for those who are going to be heading into different parts of the culture where it's hard to be a Christian, I think the formational reality of training people how to live with that at colleges and not hiding from the world, I think is a really important thing that people are doing. So that's my little attempt at answering that question.
Great. Thank you, Mark. We hope that was helpful to you, Alan, and others that find themselves in that context. Let's move. Oh,
sorry,
yeah.
Can I just add a little thought in there as well? Just for what it's worth, I feel like a lot of the conversations I'm having with 18 to 22-year-olds nowadays has actually been, I'm finding it really encouraging, and just a real, real hunger and willingness to be led and to be encouraged, and for kind of tools to live in this kind of weird grey zone moment. Just a quick thought in there. I'm actually really hopeful about Gen Z and
Gen Z.
Sorry.
Well, it's like zucchini and courgette, coriander and cilantro. Yeah. And just on
Generation aubergine.
I think that's a great point, because I think maybe in the past you could, as a Christian, we've talked a lot about here the shift that's happened post-COVID of sort of the disappearance of cultural Christianity. And maybe in the past you could be a Christian and sort of like float through in some, campus ministry and, not affect you. But now I think it's like, it's full on, and, you will have to be serious about your faith, So I think that's an opportunity, and I think combined with what you were just saying, if we can learn to disciple people in those environments, that's a great foundation for the rest of people's lives.
Yeah, it's good.
That's great. Thanks, Daniel. Okay, well, our next question is from Glenn in Hong Kong. I have been wondering why over the past 10 to 15 years or so in particular, I've encountered more and more Christians who feel compelled to follow the Jewish dietary and Sabbath rules. Is there something going on in culture right now that is driving this movement to lean into the Old Testament laws instead of celebrating freedom in Christ?
Great question. I have not seen that trend of late in particular. A couple of thoughts. The first one is, this is a really interesting live question for Jewish followers of Jesus. So I know there's a lot of discussion in like the Messianic Jewish community around at what levels should Jewish followers of Jesus what elements of the Torah should they follow. But I think probably more what Glenn's getting at here is people who are not Jewish. And there are different times throughout Christian history, like particularly in 19th century Russia, there was a movement called the Judaizers, who basically sort of was trying to be a kind of renewal movement within the Orthodox Church, who then went back and sort of, took on a lot of sort of Torah observance, and that actually some of the people trace some of the contemporary versions of anti-Semitism back to that moment in contemporary Russia. So you do see these historical trends where people start to, look at the different laws and ask the question. You do see some sort of return back to that. I haven't seen that in terms of, very sort of overt taking on, say, of kosher eating or whatever. I do wonder, though, that in moments, one thing I have been seeing, I think there's in moments where the world is out of control.
Yes.
That we don't have control over, the world anymore and perhaps the ways that we thought we could. There are things which we sort of can take control over. And I wonder if there's a temptation in moments like that to fall back into some of these things. And I think we've spoken on here before that, classic Tertullian quote, whether he said it or not, it's still a good one. There's some debate as to whether he said it, but, just as Jesus was crucified between two thieves, forever the gospel exists between, irreligion and religiosity. And I think there's always that temptation to form into sort of, taking, that sort of law back on ourselves in different ways. And maybe even, some of the things which people perhaps have found helpful of, having Sabbath and different things like that. There is always that question we need to ask as followers of Jesus. At what point is this something which is helping us to actually something which is hindering us and actually just something we're sort of, returning to, I guess, a sort of workspace mentality. So that's sort of what I would think. But I need to think about that more. I haven't noticed it. Have you guys noticed it or examples of it?
I mean, I guess when I read this, I thought of things like the Daniel fast, which I know many churches have run or done collectively as congregations. Also think about maybe the Nazarite vow.
True.
Stuff which has been happening. Well, I've seen it in a number of leaders over a number of years recently, but other than that, probably not. I mean, I guess Sabbath is a significant thing that we talk about.
As creator of the Daniel fast, Daniel, how did you?
It's a high protein
pastry.
High pastry,
carbohydrate diet.
Daniel 2.0.
I think what I've noticed though is it's probably in our field anyway. It's kind of more the postures that Sabbath offers and fasting offers and the posture that we're brought before God in more so than the religious kind of rule following of it. Is probably what I've noticed and experienced, which I think is great worth and great beauty in.
Definitely. Yeah. Oh, well, that'll be one to watch out for. A question from Mike. Hi guys, my question is, in South Africa. Hi guys, my question is, where does a country like South Africa fit into the Western cultural story and overall in God's plan for renewal? We're not a Western country, but we're influenced by it in a major way. I'm not sure that's a good thing though.
Great question, Mike, and hello to not just Mike, but all of our listeners in South Africa. This is a fantastic question. I think South Africa is an absolutely fascinating country because, before I get to what is South Africa's relationship to the West, I think I've mentioned on here before, I think the question of the West is a really interesting one to examine. What do we mean by the West? Traditionally the West was Europe, but you just look at the diversity in a place like Europe between Iceland and Greece. Is Russia Western or is it Eastern? This is a country, Russia's sort of, is Central Europe versus Western Europe, the English-speaking world, and then, you look at the other sort of West, which could be, the Anglosphere, which is, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, America, the United Kingdom. And it's really interesting at the moment. You look at the Ukraine war and you look at some of the alliances, people are talking less about the West as we're talking about this alliance of democracies now. So, for example, Hungary, which is traditionally a Western country, isn't as aligned with the rest of the West, perhaps around some of the issues in Ukraine. But weirdly, Japan and South Korea and Singapore are sort of in line with this sort of Western coalition. So I think we're seeing this, reimagining of what the West is. But, I think what South Africa is of note of South Africa is a South Africa where is a place where there's lots of influences happening. I just remember sort of traveling around Cape Town and being in parts which, was super Western, and you'd be in a cafe and then you'd be other parts which was, very clearly sort of African culturally, and but not just those two. You have South Africa has an incredible ethnic diversity. There's Asian culture, there's Muslim culture, there's Indian culture, and different African cultures and different European cultures. Afrikaans and English and Portuguese and Greek and so on. So I think South Africa is a really fascinating microcosm of the diversity of the globe in one place. And look, I've always felt that there is this really key part that I think South Africa plays in the global story. I think the story of redemption that comes out of South Africa, after its long period of, apartheid, was one that really captured the world. And, I think that there is a redemptive purpose for South Africa. But then South Africa, it's interesting at the moment, I know that just look at the news in the last little while, the South African government, I think, is trying to extradite the Guptas, which is a family of business people who were accused of, I think they sort of fled South Africa to Dubai. And this particular family were accused of what's being called in South African media state capture, where they sort of in their relationships with government, almost sort of like oligarchs, took a lot of, South African, I think, industry and, for basically profit and some of this extractive, abusive financial relationship. But it's interesting that word state capture, it's an interesting word from, a completely worldly perspective and understanding how that can work in a nation. But, when I've heard that word in reading the South African news, I also think there's that redemptive history that God has for South Africa of this, truly diverse place and, with this redemptive story and, a place that is marked, by the Christian story really deeply in many of those communities. And that idea of state capture, it's also a spiritual word, isn't it? Like the enemy wants to capture the nations and different peoples of the world. And so I feel like there's a deep spiritual battle over that sort of spiritual destiny, for South Africa. So South Africa is a country I pray for a lot. Everything in the world in South Africa, it's a country which, is economically, I think, one of the most unequal places in the world. But that's also something we see in other parts of the world. A lot of the trends in the world are happening in South Africa. And I think, therefore, the role that the church in South Africa has to play is to be at the forefront of what God's doing in the world, because things that work out at a local and national and regional level in South Africa also, can be, the rest of the world can learn from that.
Yep.
And I think also, South Africa also does have a real leadership role in the broader African continent as well. So, that's just some of the thoughts around South Africa. But I think that in some ways also South Africa, I think you're right there, Mike, your comments. South Africa is not a Western country. It's influenced by positive and negative ways. But that's why I think it's a brilliant laboratory, or cutting edge is probably a better word, of what mission and ministry at this time in a globalized world. And, I think in a century where Africa has a really important part to play in the bigger global story, I think South Africa is a really strategic country for what God is doing in the world at this moment. So, I will continue, I'm not South African, not in South Africa, but I will continue to pray for the church in South Africa.
That's good. Thanks, Mark. I just sort of wonder on that as well. We've probably been at this point for a long time, but are we beyond the binary of Western, like East and West?
Yeah.
It seems like such an unhelpful dichotomy to
much to try and include.
Yeah, and it's shifting all the time. Like if we're in grey zone and all of the constructs that helped us define, what the world looked like are now in complete flux. How are we supposed to understand the world through like West and East? I don't know. To me, it seems like an unhelpful
I agree.
term now, but I don't know. I don't know how you move a term on like that.
I mean, just to throw a few thoughts around, I think I read Michael Reed's book, The Forgotten Continent, on South America, and he talked about, South America is sometimes called the Third West. We don't think about South America, but look at downtown Buenos Aires. It's deeply shaped by Europe. I think it's almost like, so for example, there are more Europeans in more people of European Western stock, for want of a better term, in Buenos Aires than there would be in Australia, Canada, or America.
Yeah, okay.
We're more ethnically diverse, but it's a very, lots of Italians and people of Spanish descent, and there's Germans in Brazil, and so is Brazil Western?
Yeah,
and you've got Australia, New Zealand, where in the Pacific, are we Pacific? Are we Western? Are we, but you look at parts of Melbourne are very Asian, parts of, Auckland are very Pacifica culture, like a Māori culture. And I think these questions are becoming a lot more plastic and bendable, and then you think about the fact that you can find pockets in Lagos, Nigeria of people who are thinking like American Western people.
Yes.
And then you can find pockets in America of people who maybe migrant communities from other parts of the world who are not thinking Western. So it's very, and even in some people, you've got all of that happening at once, if you're a second or third culture sort of person.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think, Kishore Mahbubani, he wrote a book on Asia, sort of the Asian century. I think he makes the point that, he's arguing that the Asia is acting more Western than the West now in terms of their development and their institutions and how they're building cities and their, on reason, he says the West is becoming less Western.
Yes.
So again what is the West? Is West ancient Greece? Like what is West Britain? Yeah. Is America the West? I agree. I think it's becoming a really confusing term. And I think part of what I've thought as well, and what really hit me is I know when we did this cultural moment, we talked a lot about the church in the West, but just the overwhelming feedback I had from people, so many emails and messages like, hey, I'm in this country, which is not considered West, but everything you're talking about
is applicable.
Is applicable here, and it's sort of this, almost some people use the term global culture, sort of thing where you can go to, like if you're in a mall in Dubai, like what's Dubai? Like you're in this mall in Dubai and it's like, so anyway, I think I agree with you. I think it's becoming harder to define.
Yeah.
And can I just say that too? Like there is this sort of almost this thing to defend the West, and look, I think there's elements of the West, which, there's some, like any culture, however you define the West, of every culture, there's things which align with the gospel, are neutral around the gospel and are anti-gospel.
Yeah.
But I don't think the future is this sort of defensive, here's some of this sort of pushback on the right against some things of, it's the defense of the West. Well, what is the West?
Yes.
You're questioning, what are you talking about?
Yeah. And that was something that Newbegin pointed out as well, that in every culture there's going to be a yes.
Yes.
And there's going to be a no.
Yes.
So navigating in whatever context you're in, what does the gospel actually say about how we're living and what's going on in culture?
And just to end with another Newbegin thing. I mean, he was in India for many, many years, returned to, I think it was Birmingham in the UK, and then found himself returning to his neighbourhood, which he'd left how many decades earlier, filled with people from India, and he could even speak the language to people, so it's like, it's all very elastic, I think, at the moment.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for that, Mike. We'll move on to a question from Danny from North Carolina. Can you dive deeper into the 4 worldviews you talked about last episode, and specifically how it has manifested in the Western Church? The word again. For example, purity culture was founded in the moralistic worldview. If you don't have sex before marriage, then your marriage will be easy and blessed.
The sin chart. The people loved the sin chart. We're thinking of putting it on T-shirts and sending it out to everyone.
Yeah. Looking forward to walking the streets of Melbourne with the sin chart.
Yeah. And on the back, read it. Read it, live it, love it.
Full disclosure, we're not thinking of doing that.
Yes, that's a joke. Really interesting. So basically, for those who don't know, because again, too, even sort of purity culture is often thrown around in American sort of spheres, and you hear it in different places, but effectively, this is something which means different things in different places. But I think what I would get at there is I think there was a reaction to some of the hedonistic. So we talked about the hedonistic worldview, which was basically the point of life is pleasure. The church saw that as a threat, and therefore I would say tried to do a sort of conversation between the moralistic with the hedonistic, where there was a hedonistic payoff. And it doesn't just have to be about sex. It can be about wealth or lifestyle. So basically, like, we're asking you to we're asking you to not say yes to the hedonistic worldview, but here's an alternate hedonistic payoff.
Yeah. Can you explain more what you mean?
Is it a little bit of a redefinition of what blessing is?
Yes.
Like,
yes.
just blessing, quote unquote, is kind of hidden. Like, you can almost put things in the hedonistic category.
Yes.
Okay.
So I put it in, way I've talked about this before is explicit and implicit prosperity gospel. Yeah. So there's the classic Alma Gantry prosperity gospel. Alma Gantry is a 1950s film about a preacher who was sort of a bit of a fraud.
What was it?
Alma Gantry. There was also a Steve Martin film as well about a sort of prosperity.
Oh, really?
Yeah, sort of comedy. I forgot what it's called. Anyway, the classic sort of explicit prosperity gospel of, give to rebuilders, and for every dollar you give, you'll receive tenfold back.
Yeah, okay.
And we've got a subscriber who sent in money to rebuilders, and 2 weeks later they got a Ferrari left in their garage. So that sort of thing. Like, you give this, and there's a definite mathematical equation that you get that. And therefore, this is why you see, sort of prosperity preachers, with ostentatious lifestyles, and here's my mansion, here's my Ferrari, here's my G5 jet, because this is how God is blessing me, that thing. So we get that. That's explicit. But then there can be this implicit kind of prosperity gospel where follow Jesus and your life will be filled with good experience. It won't be as overt as a Ferrari. Yeah. But if you sacrifice over here, you're going to have no difficulty over there.
Yes.
So I think this is what Danny's getting at there. So it's sort of like, well, follow God's plan for marriage, and you'll have to say no there, but marriage will be awesome. Do you know what I mean? Like, we'll say no before marriage, but it's going to be awesome. And then people get to that and it's like, hang on, we've got difficulties. Life is, we're in the in-between, the kingdom breaking out, but not here fully. And what's going on? I didn't get the payoff I expected.
Yes.
And it could be other things. It could be, I sacrificed this for ministry, and ministry tends to be really difficult. Why is it still hard? Not that anyone listening can identify with that. And so, I think that really it's more that there's the 4 worldviews. And interesting, people have sent through more. Maybe we can talk about that. People have had sent in their own editions.
I haven't seen these.
Yeah. Yeah, my friend Thomas Villa in Denmark. Hello, Thomas. He sent through a couple of extras, so we can maybe talk about them another time, and maybe
great.
Others have got some other interesting ones. It's growing. The sin chart is growing.
It's going to be a sin periodic table before we know it.
So the idea that I think it was more a coping technique to try and respond to the hedonistic one.
Okay.
I think, is what's going on.
So, that, and I guess you mentioned it last week when, we had like the sexual revolution of the 60s, and church culture, particularly in the 90s, did a real swing back, and that's when there was that emergence of the whole purity culture thing in the problematic term, the Western church.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Danny, for your question. We'll move on to a question from Shayla in Texas. Something my peers, I'm just going to say this is probably the last question for this episode.
Yes.
Something my peers and I have noticed since COVID is something we jokingly call the Great Reshuffling, where longtime members of churches are leaving for not being progressive or conservative enough, theologically or politically, and then searching for a new one to fit their desires. I was wondering if you could comment on that trend.
Thank you, Shayla. Great question. Yes, 100% seeing this, but I would even broaden it out. So Shayla's in Texas, and I think that would be very correct in what I'm hearing from particularly a lot of people in the States of there's a lot of political reshuffling happening in the church where people, perhaps those questions weren't addressed politically, and then all of a sudden with everything that's happened in the last few years politically in the United States, there's been a reshuffling, and there's been little bits of that in other places outside of the US. in places like Canada and so on. But weirdly, I'm seeing this non-politically as well.
Yeah,
like, I was talking to someone who went to an event recently and caught up with a bunch of old friends from all different church backgrounds, and all of them said to this person, we're considering moving church.
Yeah, wow.
And it wasn't political. It was like, oh, I don't like the preaching there, or I just wondered if we need to move. And it's almost like, I think what's happened as well. So there is the political polarization thing, which is a huge influence in America. We've spoken about that before. But also you're seeing this sort of great rethink after COVID, the pause of COVID, and just as people are rethinking their jobs, and there's the great resignation. There's an article today that, Melbourne, the amount of people who've left Melbourne and moved to the region. So there's also this great move away from the cities, like a great rethink of where we live, how we live, what we do. People are more choosy with their time. And I think we're seeing that around the church. So I think that, we've called it the washing machine, is I think that, we're having lots of people come to Red and just like, I'm just checking out, I'm looking for a different church. There's this great movement of people. How long that's going to continue for, I don't know, but I think it's here for a little while longer. So I think that the disruption of COVID in that sense this is not a result of COVID. COVID sparked this, but this is a bigger thing. I'm struggling to put my finger on one trend because I think it's different in different places. But the big trend, and I haven't properly analysed it, is that people who you thought were always going to continue in your church habitually, that's not going to happen anymore. And I'm hearing lots of people who haven't yet left. So you're hearing lots of people like, we're giving it to the end of the year.
Yes.
For all different reasons. So I've heard that statement a lot. So I think it's going to continue for another 12 months or more. So I would put this under a trend to keep our eye on and maybe just observe that over the next sort of 12 months how that happens.
All right. Well,
just on that, is it any quick, because I know there's lots of pastors and leaders in this environment and perhaps facing this challenge, any encouragement or thoughts on how, like, what do you do with that if your congregation's before you? And it could just be 50% like, oh, actually I could be moving on. So like, how do you lead, how you pastor? If you can just give us the one sentence answer to that.
No, we'll give you 2 sentences.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So kind. I wonder whether we'll do a future episode on this, but a few quick thoughts. And we've had some discussion offline and as a team about this, just to let everyone else on the air know. I think there's always been a dynamic between the universal church and the local church. So we are part of the universal church. If someone from a church in Kenya and a church in Jamaica and a church in Thailand joined us here and we were like, let's pray together, and we prayed, that's the universal church. The rebuilders, just look at all the different countries, Hong Kong, South Africa, North Carolina, people that are listening now, this is the universal church, different church backgrounds and stuff, denominations, listening to rebuilders, us participating in this is this translocational thing, which is evidence that the universal church has relationship with each other.
Yeah.
So that's a really important thing. Then there's the expression of the local church. The local church helps us live out the universal church, but we do it in a particular time and place in community. And then we choose to be accountable to those people in that life on life, iron sharpening iron discipleship. Do not give up in the habit of meeting together. Now, traditionally throughout most of history, it was really hard for your average Christian in the local church to connect with the universal church.
Yeah.
You might go to a big conference.
Yep.
You might read a Christian magazine. You might read a Christian book. But actually the content and opportunity to connect with the universal church was actually quite small and really hard to do. And you think like in the Middle Ages, maybe you want a pilgrimage to the cathedral or something, but it was really rare and difficult to do. It was 99% local church. Over time, because of the internet, stuff like what we're doing here, the content provided by the universal church has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. As technology has meant that streaming and podcasting and books and I think books were always there. So perhaps I shouldn't say books, but I think the digital offerings.
TikTok.
TikTok. Follow Daniel Fast at TikTok
2.0.
2.0.
He's got some great dances.
Yeah, great dances, and tells you how you can follow the Levitical code through dance. It's moving. So I think that what's happened is the possibility where you feel you can get some of the stuff that the local church used to give you through the universal church started to appear. Boom, COVID happens. Boom. That's how it was like boom.
Yeah.
Boom.
I remember it. I remember it well.
COVID happens and everyone is like fast forwarded 30 years in that process. So we're all looking, we're then trying to do our local church purely through digital for when you couldn't meet in person. So I think a lot of people all of a sudden started to go, hang on, I'm listening to that worship album over there and I'm following that preacher on Instagram there and I'm listening to that podcast over there and following what that ministry is doing. And I think this thing started to come in where maybe we can sort of be like universal church Christians, but without needing a local expression. Mm-hmm. Or I've got a local expression, but I want it to match what I'm accessing digitally online.
Yes.
So I go back to my church and, maybe politically or maybe just qualitatively, they're not talking about what that group's talking about or that doesn't align with that. So if you think about it, it's almost like a new kind of denominationalism where it's like a denominationalism of choice.
Yes.
So I think digital gives you the option, seeming option that you don't need to be a local Christian. Now, this is probably also for leaders who are asking the question, what do I do about this? This would also explain why you have people coming to you going, love what you guys are doing around community, but don't like your preaching or don't like your theological statement on that. Can you change that? So it's like this, it's like Netflix. I'm flicking through the options on Netflix or I'm picking the algorithms on Amazon or something. So I would come back to the fact that what an incredible time to be alive, that we can have this incredible output of great content from around the world. Like I can watch the Bible Project. I can listen to, the thoughts of Tim Keller. I can hear what Christians are thinking in that country and access all this stuff. That's brilliant. The church is more connected translocationally than ever. Example, what we're doing right now, that I can go to the other side of the world and people know us. They'll feel like they know us. But it's not the same as being in community, in time and place, in a local church.
Yeah.
Rebuilders cannot disciple you in a way that someone following you, not following you, someone who you are in a week-on-week thing. We can present in a particular way here.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And people can listen in a particular way. But when you're with people and they see you in your good, in your bad, they see the whole of your life, there's those repeated in-person rhythms. I think coming back in person after COVID has reminded me there's just some stuff that digital can't do. There's some brilliant stuff digital can do, but there's some stuff that the digital can't do. So, I would then to come all the way after setting that up is ministers and pastors and whatever and leaders in a local context. We need to understand why we're doing the local.
Yeah.
We need to be advocates of the local as the best discipleship context that people can live out their following of Jesus. The universal stuff, brilliant, but it's additional.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And also we need to be symbols of the kingdom in our local community. Do you know what I mean? Like if you're listening to, Tim Keller and you're watching the Bible Project and you're following this and doing that, that's brilliant. But that needs to then flow out into this is how it's affecting your town. This is how it's affecting your group of relationships. This is how it's affecting your friendships and so on like that. So the universal church has to have a local church expression. That's really, really key. Long answer, but took us an extra 10 minutes, but I think it was worth it.
Yeah, definitely worth it. Thank you for that, Mark. And thank you to all of you who have sent in questions. We're hoping to get back to more of them next time.